Groovy. Thank you very much. Oh, there's a clock on the screen. Run. Big. Okay. Smile.
Or not, since they tore it down.
Oops.
So you can document exactly who was here and made the obnoxious comments?
I was here, and so were you. Well, it's 5 past. We might as well get started. So I'm going to discuss open source software and why it's not just free software. So my name is Damien McKenna. I'm a lead Drupal architect with the company Media Current out of Atlanta. I live in Keene and telework, and you can find me online as Damien McKenna. And there's my Drupal user ID, but they've updated that since. So to give you a quick 5-second summary, basically, open source is great. Everybody should give 10%. 10% investment in your future, which translates into 10% contrib time. But so the longer version. So I'd like to give you a quick history lesson. So why am I here today? I'm kind of an accidental web geek. I didn't really want to get into programming, and at one point I thought I never would get into it very much. But I started fiddling with HTML a long time ago, and then discovered a thing called Dreamweaver. And in Dreamweaver you can do templates and not have to change the menu every single time you have a new page. And then discovered, there's a thing called PHP, and there's an includes, and it can put the stuff into one file and separate out everything rather nicely. And then, if I put the content in a database, I can pull it out and then have even fewer files and make it even easier to manage and maintain. And by 2000 was doing logins and whatnot, basically building a rudimentary CMS. 2003 had gone through multiple iterations of my own thing and had a multilingual, template-driven content and e-commerce system, just because back then that's what you did. So I was interested in working on content management systems and building them from the point of view of making my own site, because I didn't like having to mess up my own HTML. But there's a few, all CMSs have a few common pieces. There's the visitor side that the general public sees. There's the admin side. You've got different types of content. So you might have, say, news articles, products, yada, 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 product descriptions. And generally, they're expandable in some way. And back then, I started to realize, you know, I can't be the only person who's building these. As it turns out, there are plenty of them. There's a list on on Wikipedia, where they list all of the main content management systems. Last night I checked, and it was 119 open source ones on that list. There are even more commercial ones, and they were on 11 different platforms. And there are tons more on GitHub, where people build their own thing for a particular site, upload it, and then leave it at that. So you could find a different one for every day of the week if you're, for a year, if you're so inclined. So through that, discovered, you know, I'm not the only one who's doing these, and started to get into realizing, you know, I can contribute. Through working with these, I can end up, you know, if I fix something, upload it and start contributing. Back in 2000, I was working with a company that wanted a thing for doing mailing lists, so downloaded this thing called PHP list and sent the maintainer some file attachments with some fixes. But that was my first discovery of open source. Then in 2003, discovered TikiWiki, which was a rather interesting system. By 2004, had taken a sidestep into the world of Cold Fusion, and there was a system called Fusebox that wasn't so much a CMS, it was just a framework, but again, it was somewhat open source. And then somebody decided, hey, let's bring this to PHP. So I started using that. By 2006, I was starting to work with Ruby on Rails and the Radiant CMS. 2 years later, originally it was 2007, but it was 2008 when I really got into Drupal. And by this year at the moment, I'm the 18th top contributor. So just mention, I didn't start these, obviously, but I just contribute to them. So I've ended up coming a long way just by wanting to not do it all myself. So in open source, when you start looking at a thing, there's a common research thing called the 5 Ws. So it's what, who, when, where, and why. And it's a standard practice to, when you're researching something, it's used in journalism, scientific research, police investigations, etc. And just to mention it, these were covered, by a presentation yesterday by Pete Johansson, so I apologize if you're seeing duplicate information, but anyway, so let's move along. So what, why, when, what, who, when, where, and why. So first question is, well, what is open source? Often shortened to OSS. So it's open source software. To explain a little more, let's reverse it. It's software with source that's open. So software, obviously, computer software. But to take that a step further, what is a computer? Obviously, you know computers. These days, a phone is a computer, a tablet. But you've got things like game systems. You've got TiVo and DVR machines. You've got, this is actually the display on a dashboard for entertainment system on an airplane. You can see the nice familiar penguin logo. But you've got networking equipment using software. You've got refrigerators using software. That's a dashboard off of a car. Pretty much almost everything you buy today, more or less, has some sort of a computer running it, and therefore it's going to have software controlling what it does. So everything. So software, there's a lot of common open source software that you'll be at least familiar with to some degree. Linux, GNU Linux, Mozilla Firefox, Apache web server, WordPress, Git, etc. These are all software projects that are open source that you'll be familiar with. But the open source isn't necessarily always free. There are commercial open source packages as well, which is a little surprising. So you can have, oftentimes, the main software package itself may be free, or sometimes it's you pay for a core package and then you've got plugins and themes and stuff that go with it. So there turns out to be a whole bunch of fairly common and popular commercial open source packages. Even MySQL, surprisingly enough, is not it has a commercial side to it. RHEL is Red Hat's Linux distribution. The Yoast plugin that is used very commonly with WordPress has a commercial side to it. And most of the time you're either buying additional options in these systems, like you might be able to download a free version, or download without having to pay for it, a version that can, say, work on your computer, but if you want to have a more enterprisey version that covers your entire network or something, your company's network, like with the backup systems, you have to pay for that. Or maybe you want to have commercial support available 24/7, so that if something goes down at 3 o'clock in the morning, somebody else deals with it and not you. So the second part of open source is source. So that's obviously code. So you've got things like PHP, you've got JavaScript, CSS, C#, just anything that is code can be encompassed in this. And the more interesting part is the open aspect. So this gets into the availability of the code to you to look at. The interesting part is that you may be working with a competitor to do so. And behind it all, there should be a collaborative effort, and you'll most likely have a license that defines what you can and cannot do. And these days, from the collaborative aspect, a tremendous amount of open source work is driven through GitHub. It is, for those who've been around long enough, it's kind of the contemporary replacement for SourceForge. But many other projects out there self-host. Commonly known one is Drupal.org that has resisted the temptation to move to GitHub. WordPress.org has their own things as well. And a huge amount of projects still do their own thing. So putting it all together, open source software is computer software that can be commercial or free, but the key part is that you've got the source code available for you to examine and work on. You'll have a collaborative community of some sort behind it, and then a software license that mandates what is allowed. At the license side, there are a whole bunch of different licenses, and each one will have different allowances on what you can and cannot do. And the key part of that is the derivations and what you're allowed to do with the changes that you make. And also, can this part that is, say, commercial, not through the same license, integrate with this other thing? And there's actually an international organization called the Open Source Initiative that is kind of an umbrella for a lot of the, well, to a degree, legalese, but the movement behind this. And they've got a site, opensource.org. And that movement was spearheaded a lot by Eric S. Raymond and Bruce Perrins. So in the licenses, there are absolutely tons of them. The new General Public License, GPL for short, version 2 is one of the most commonly used, but there's an updated version called version 3, or GPL 3. There's a BSD license, Apache Foundation have their own, the Mozilla Foundation have their own, and generally they all have very different nuances on what you can and cannot do. Some of them will let you work with, integrate with commercial pieces. Some of them will let you take the code, completely change it up whatever way you want, and sell it as your own. That's completely within their license. And then some of them actually let you distribute it without having to include the source code, which starts getting a little complicated. But before we get too far, we need to remember where this comes from. Back in the early 1900s, somebody came up with a design for two-stroke engines for vehicles and came up with a patent on it, and then started this whole war over which companies were allowed to use this design, and went to court, and they ended up coming up with an association that all these vehicle manufacturers joined to pay to join the thing, that the association. Then they got free rights to use any of the patents, any of the designs that other companies had come up with. So it stopped a lot of the infighting and craziness then. Skip forward to the 1970s, IT companies started doing the same thing, where before you would buy, say, a $10,000 printer and get the source code that ran it along with it and be free to make modifications yourself. Then the printer manufacturers started to realize, well, I don't want to give out my source code, and but the people who are used to being able to get the code, make fixes, upload the fixes, and share them around, started arguing about this. One of the most well-known is Richard Stallman, RMS for short, who started a project, an international project, to spearhead the notion that there should be a way of getting all software free, that you could, well, let me refine that the software should be freely customizable and obtainable. You may have to pay money to get it, but once you get it, you have the freedom to work with it the way that you want. Then 2 years later started the Free Software Foundation to push that more as a general thing, general movement, rather than strictly just the source code. The OSS movement then kind of picked up in the 90s, late 90s, from an article that Eric S. Raymond wrote called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, that discussed a lot of the things he had seen in within the free software movement, within commercial software development, and how projects, a lot of the things he had learned, like you would tend to have, when you've got a lot of people able to download code, you'll have, some people will upload fixes and changes and help improve it, but you'll have a lot of people who don't. And so that really kind of came to a head then when Netscape in 1998 decided they were going to open source their browser, that until that point had been a commercial product. Which, that then ultimately led to what we call Mozilla Firefox today, and the Mozilla Foundation. And later on, after a few months, a number of internationally known people got together and started the open source initiative and came up with the term open source as an umbrella term for the stuff we do today. And they published the open source definition, which is a set of 10 rules that govern whether or not something is really considered open source, and that it's a kind of a yardstick to check a software license against to see if it's open source or not. Because a lot of licenses, a lot of companies will release software and have their own custom license, and really until it has been vetted by the OSI, they can't, well, they can call it open source, but it's kind of almost poisoning the well, because it may not really be open. So, and that kind of, to extend out to the free software movement, you'll often have FOSS uses a phrase, free and open source software, and then FLOSS, F-L-O-S-S, free libre open source software. Apologies for missing that extra slide. So another aspect of what can we do with open source? Obviously you can use the software. What can you do to work on it? There are lots of different things that people can do to work with open source software. If you know how to code, you can improve it. If you know HTML, JavaScript, if you can write documentation that other people can actually understand, you can help. You can do presentations. So other things you can do is brainstorm ways of improving it. Do marketing, event organizing, fundraising to help other people cover their bills while they're working on the software. Sometimes just hanging out, sometimes doing baby care and childcare. At many open source software conventions around the world now, they're starting to have childcare available as a service. So you've got somebody taking care of the person's children while they're going to learn more and better themselves. So anyway, back to the 5 Ws. So who does this stuff? So obviously software, we've got software engineers, we've got usability and UX designers, project managers, technical writers, teachers, painters, pizza delivery people. One of the most well-known Drupal contributors used to be a pizza delivery person until he got into web development. You've got students, artists, hobbyists, children. The Drupal project has had people who are 11 years old contributing to the project. You've got rocket scientists. One of the Drupal Easy duo, or 3.0 at this point, used to be a rocket scientist for NASA. You've got doctors. One of the people behind the Omega theme for Drupal was in training to be a doctor, but got more into the software side. Basically, humanoids. So ultimately, anyone. There's a saying in the Drupal community, and it kind of has become its motto, that you come for the software, but stay for the community. And you, lovely people. Just to dispel some myths, there's a common myth that you have to be an absolute genius to do this stuff. No, you don't have to be a genius. You don't have to like Weird Al. You don't have to like British comedy. You don't even have to watch Doctor Who. I've never seen a single episode of Doctor Who.
Against 2 eyes.
All that you require is some interest and enthusiasm. So at this point, I'd just like to throw in a recommendation regarding communication, whether you're submitting a bug report, just talking with somebody on a forum, on IRC, whatever. And I bring this up because, oddly enough, there have been a lot of problems over the years with infighting and people getting upset over things, and a lot of infighting at times. So generally, treat everyone with respect. Whether you're submitting a bug report, whether you're just getting into a conversation, bike shedding on something, you can spend ages hashing out an idea, but always remember the other person, the other people that you're interacting with are just like you. They have a life. They don't need to be having a hernia because of a conversation online. So when you're working online, write what you're writing with respect to the other people. Write clearly and have patience. Remember that the other people aren't working for you. They're not at your beck and call at 3 o'clock in the morning. Hey, my site went down because of a bug in your code. I'm sorry. The person may have a life event that takes them out of the community or whatever for an extended period of time. One thing in the Drupal community, many of us have had children in the last couple of years. And when that happens, if you haven't had children, it complicates your life quite a lot. One person has had, he and his wife have had 2 children in the span of time Drupal 8 was being developed. And he disappeared. I mean, rightly so. He had something more important to deal with. He was keeping up with his day job, making sure they had food on the table, a roof over their heads, and taking care of his new family. Some people have had health problems, have had to pull out indefinitely. So just be patient. And there are some role models you might want to take into consideration. So you've got a bad role model and a good role model. Generally, if what you're writing could be put to a beat and sang by Robin Thicke, you might want to rewrite it. However, if it could be sang by Chris Martin of Coldplay, you're doing pretty good. So don't be hating, be respectful. And if nothing else, think of it as you're writing something to your parents half an hour before you're going to get on the phone with them. So, next W, when. So, a lot of us don't watch football, and we'll have lots of quiet evenings, or quiet mornings, or quiet weekends where you've got an hour or so and do this. So some people have an evening job that gives them extra time. Sometimes people go on vacation and sit there on their laptop working away on some random crazy project. But ultimately, I hope more people get to do it at work. So where, obviously, then? At home, at conferences. There are things called code sprints where a bunch of people get together and work on a particular project for a while. Some people just go to the library. User groups, but again, hopefully at work. So one of the things is that ultimately companies that use open source ought to be contributing, which leads us to the 5th W, why? So in the before times, you'd have companies with, let's veer off into, or veer back to content management systems again, because that's my own personal thing. You'd have companies with sites that are visited by hundreds of millions of people every month. You have giant organizations with billions of dollars of funding. You have major sports organizations, major news organizations, national stores with thousands of locations all over the country and sometimes the world. You have giant international media companies. You've got these sites with hundreds of millions of people visiting them every year. Multi-billion-dollar companies that have dozens of staff working on this stuff day in, day out as their 9-to-5 thing. And they would be buying commercial CMSs. So they would be spending millions of dollars on licensing fees. They'd be spending more millions of dollars on custom work that the provider of the software would be doing for them. All of the customizations would be custom just for them. And then what happens if, well, we've paid millions of dollars for this thing, but they just went out of business and the software disappeared. What do we do now? Or we need 3 more people to work on this thing. How do we find people who have used it before? So an IP lawyer from, I think it was Australia, wrote this interesting article a few years ago that recognize that vendors of commercial software have a disincentive to interoperate. And the disincentive grows as their market share improves because they want to hold on to their baby. They don't want to share. There's no sharing. So imagine a world in a world. So imagine instead of these giant mega companies with billions of dollars being funneled into all of their stuff. Imagine if that was being shared, if that was collaborative, if the giant things, all of the funding that they're putting into their systems could also benefit somebody like CARE, the CARE organization, an international relief agency, or Habitat for Humanity that help build houses for people in need, or Amnesty International, an international human rights organization. All these small little news sites that have a desperate time making ends meet each year, but are a vital piece of getting news to people locally, or personal sites. It's nice to write a blog post to say how the new family are going, or doing. So if there was more sharing, there'd be more people benefiting from it. So the flip side of that is, if you benefit, you should be helping. So if your business depends upon free and open source software, then free and open source software depends upon you. So let's put this into terms that a business would understand, the bottom dollar. If you're using free and open source software, you're saving potentially millions of dollars in often annual license fees for software. You're saving millions in customizations that you don't have to pay this one vendor for. You can do it yourself. You can take it to a different company. At the same time, if you're allowing your staff to interact with open source projects more, you're letting them become more skilled. They're opening their eyes to more things. They're getting more experience, not necessarily on everything that your company needs, but potentially, and it's just helping them to learn more. It can also be used as PR for the company. I write a monthly review at work of all of the contributions that our company has made in the past month, and that has been a tremendous boon for the company for the PR side. It can also help find potential staff, because these days a lot of people look for that. They want to be able to contribute to an open source project. They want to, and then they want to work at a company that gives them time to do so. And it can also just simply help improve the tools that other people in the company are using day to day. So then it gives you a chance to act, not react. You're not waiting for somebody else to make a decision that fits with what you want to do. You have the chance to steer the ship in the direction you want. It gives you a chance of training your staff for the future. There's an old saying that I could not find the source of it, but where you've got two people discussing whether or not to train the staff. And one person says, well, what if we train them and they become really good and they leave? And the other person says, well, what if they don't train and they stay? So one thing I did was I was looking into, well, investments. What are some of the recommendations for minimum investment for both personal and business future? And there's a recommended minimum investment of 10%. A lot of them going to 20% and more. But at the very least, 10%, it's a reasonable amount. So out of an average work week, that's 4 hours. So if you've got 5 people in a group who are all collaborating and contributing to open source, that would be 20 hours that you would be doing, that this open source software that you're using would be benefiting from. If you've got 10, that's 40 hours out of a single week. So another way of looking at it is 10% of a team's week for existing staff. If you used to buy commercial software, imagine how many staff you could hire to improve your tools and to improve things for you for the future by putting 10% of the licensing fees into new staff. And the larger the company, the larger the team, the more you could be doing. If you've got a team, you could have one person dedicated. That's all they do. You could have a hat that people wear, so it rotates around the office. This week you've got the contrib hat, and then again hiring junior staff to train them up to what you want them to do, to work with your systems and your customizations, but lead them through the path of contributing and gaining their skills in a more open way. At a personal level, your own career can improve greatly. You get exposure to new things you wouldn't have seen before doing your 9 to 5. You get to improve your skills because you're seeing all these things. And again, it's an investment in your future too. And then personally, you gain your career improvements. You get a chance to meet a lot of new people, which is really cool. There are conventions all over the country, all over the world. And then you can also help people, which is even better. And then because of all of this collaborative contributing, businesses benefit, individuals benefit, improved tools, because it's software, for everyone. And then everybody wins. It's good to share. So one more thing I'd like to mention is, excuse me, from the perspective of diversity and privilege. If you take a look at me, you don't have to, but I'm an average white male, hetero, CSS normative, Bill Gates lookalike. Well, I've got a photo from few reasons. Anyway, I don't wear shirts too often, but so comparing the two of us, okay, sorry, wrong photo. You've got myself and Mr. Bill Gates. He's not a Dribble contributor and I'm not a multi-billionaire, but we do have a lot of similarities. We both come from privileged backgrounds. We had access to tech from an early age that many of our friends and peers did not. We were able to gain a leap forward because of our parents. And then we've been able to brush off mistakes like ignoring the internet, Mr. Gates. So at my own privilege level, I'm more likely to be taken at my own word. I'm more likely to be ranked highly in interviews because I fit the generic opinion of what somebody in tech should be. And I fit in with tech culture. And then at the same time, I'm less likely to have my decisions questioned. I'm less likely to have my abilities questioned. My lifestyle, etc. Less likely to be harassed because I'm me. So that then puts a responsibility on me and others to stop doing things that cause problems. I was in a rush, sorry. To stop telling people who are not in the same position as I am or that we are how they should respond and react in certain situations, and stop telling people what they should be, telling people who are not in the same position as us how they should be handling it. We should be listening to what they're saying and checking your own privileges, and then help when we're asked, and work with codes of conduct and promote them, that they help promote a safer environment in community organizations and meetings and work and whatnot. Then when hiring, there tend to be a lot of roadblocks set up that aren't necessary. I mean, how many computer science and web development or whatever jobs really need a bachelor's degree or a master's degree and 25 years experience in a language that came out last year? And a lot of companies tend to hire people based on where they worked at last rather than what their person's potential is. And there tends to be an emphasis for looking for people who fit the culture, who are mini clones, or I'd really like to go out for beers with this person. That doesn't matter, and it's putting unimportant barriers in front of really amazing people. There has been a lot of writing about this online over the last couple of years. This particular article is really excellent. And for more information, I recommend following Ash Dryden on Twitter and subscribing to Model View Culture. Anyway, so back to the point. Free, Libre, open source software is awesome. Everybody should be contributing, but especially companies that are benefiting from it really have an onus to contribute back and to give their staff time to do so, because it's an investment and people should focus on trying to do it 10% of their time. So thank you. Any questions?
So you were talking earlier about, I guess it's sort of the title of the presentation, but how open source software and free software, they're adjacent but not necessarily similar. And one of the things, some of the software you mentioned were what I think a lot of people call open core, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, where the core package software is freely licensed, but some commercial, additional commercial content is provided. And I was wondering, if you have an opinion on maybe the pros and cons of business models based on open core, especially in, say, the area I think your most expertise, say web CMS sites that'll have a free software engine and room for either proprietary plugins or proprietary themes.
At that level, it starts getting a little complicated with licensing. For example, just to keep it a little simpler, in the Drupal world, the distribution is licensed under the GPL2. So anything that is derived from that is therefore also GPL2. So you can, there's nothing stopping you writing a commercial plugin module, as they call them, and making that available for sale. However, the PHP code that integrates with Drupal is by definition GPL2 as well. However, any CSS and images and potentially JavaScript, that can be held proprietary under your own license. And I personally don't see anything wrong with it. It's that awkward balance of free is awesome, but I like to eat as well. And you can do a lot of good in other ways, and you can build a revenue stream for yourself or a business by just juggling it carefully. There's generally enough commercial work, development work to keep people busy, but I don't see anything, there's nothing wrong with it, with wanting to sell something, so long as you are sticking within the confines of the license. There has been some different project communities have had different debates over this over time. In WordPress, they had this big blowout and demanded kind of that all themes be made GPL2.
Yeah, I should, I guess, maybe refine my original question. I was mostly asking pros and cons relative to other ways of, either monetizing or simply sustaining a free software project from the perspective of someone who is, maintaining it, compared to other ways of increasing revenue.
Yeah, I've seen so many different things where companies open source, they started off commercial and open source it, and then a few years down the road change their mind and go back. Some have had good success. Some have had problems and it has nosedived. So there can be, it kind of depends to a degree on the direction you want to take. If you're just looking for free improvements from other people, it may not work out very well.
What I'm more talking about is like contrast the Fedora approach or the Red Hat approach to Mozilla. Many of their extensions are almost, as a rule, free to download and free to install, and the source code is shared. But in many cases, they'll have a little optional tip jar button, essentially. And that's what I'm talking about. Comparing and contrasting various ways that free software projects are able to sustain themselves over time.
Okay, so I mean, some of it comes down to how much PR you can get. If you happen to write a plugin for a thing and get a whole lot of publicity, can work out well. And some people have done well with that. It can, then you have software developers who try that approach and just get no momentum. There aren't too many surefire patterns for success. A lot of it ends up being just pure luck in the end, at the end of the day. And marketing, amusingly. So you can have, just to repeat most of what you said, you can sell a core piece of software and have free plugins and things available. Some will go the route of the opposite, that you've got a free base piece and then plugins and things are commercial that you have to pay for. You've got companies who will give you a free kind of junior version. That's a common one, like Poseidon and MySQL. And then if you want a more advanced version, you need to pay. So besides building a spreadsheet.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
So does the 10% suggestion apply to the company that hires me as well as to me? Or does it apply with both?
I would try pushing them to do so, because it's in their best interest as well, long term, if you're helping to make improvements that they may not need something today, but in 6 months' time or a year's time, they may ask you, hey, can you do this thing? Oh, yeah, I know that. I helped fix it. Sounds better than I've never heard of it before. Or, yeah, I know that one, but it doesn't work very well.
But should I also be contributing 10%, or and then is it 10% of what?
10% of your time. And that kind of depends. I believe the people who are in a position to do so should. If you can spare 10% of your week without causing your children to run off to Australia and your wife to fly to Mars, or spouse or dog, whatever it happens to be. I've already sent a dog to space. So if you're able to, then it's worthwhile doing so. If you're not in a position to do so, then honestly don't feel bad about it. hopefully there will be other people who will be able to make up. And hopefully more people will be able to persuade clients and bosses and corporate boards that this kind of investment is worthwhile.
I wonder about a particular example of Total Commander. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
The file management thing?
Yes. It was originally a clone of Norton Commander, which you could think of as Robin
Does the
Hood,
dual pane
two panes,
file manager? Yeah.
before Windows. And Norton you could think of as a great guy who opened up the PC to humans, not just IBMers. And then you could think of Total Commander, I don't know if you remember the guy's name, as being a Robin Hood because Norton was making too much money to provide a cheap version. He's got a free version where you just have to type number 3 or 2 or 1, a random number that he gives you to open it up. And if you get tired of doing that all the time, you could pay him $10 or $20 or something like that. So it's sort of a shareware, and it's maybe looked on as a good service to mankind. And then you have the open source people who have another version now that they claim is better, which is now, perhaps unfair competition already, where you have workers who are paid below minimum wage, paid nothing. And a lot of them competing with this small company that was doing a good job and, was a Robin Hood. Now he's being put in jail for being a Robin Hood. In some sense, he's being punished for not being totally free. And at each stage, I wonder about, is this a good thing to do? Is this a bad thing to do?
That's a very good question. Ash Dryden, to go back to her again, because she's awesome, wrote a really good article about how the open source mantra puts people in a position of feeling that they have to contribute free time to projects that corporations benefit from, which is why in my talk I've been trying to push that companies feel that they have the onus, not so much the individual people, so that it's not you're not forcing somebody to take up part of their day, their week, to do unpaid labor that they're still getting paid for their work. At the point of,
But they are people who are paid for that.
well, that gets into competition, and that it's a complicated one. Where say you've got two restaurants standing beside each other, a McDonald's that doesn't pay its employees very much versus a restaurant that has a good reputation for paying their staff well. Neither one is strictly wrong to a degree. It's just a balance, I guess. It's a good question, and I don't know the answer. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. Now, how do I turn this off?
I did that picture of me.
Yes. Let me turn off the screen sharing thingy first.
So you stop broadcast from the
Stop broadcast.